Hey, friends, Kenny Ortiz here. In this video, I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about how men and women are created different. And I want to re-articulate some simple truths from previous videos. For those of you who are my students, you've gone through several videos from me and from other sources at this point already. And I just want to make sure that we kind of recap some of the themes that we've already seen, both in scripture and both lessons we learn about men and women and the uniquenesses between them from the worlds of psychology and anthropology. So I think it's important. So first, a quick thought on genetic gene pool, on genes. For those of you watching on the screen here, you'll see these are this is basically DNA structure. Many of you are already familiar with this, but if you're not, every person has what we call chromosomes. There are 46 chromosomes is what each person has. You get, and they are in pairs. And so each human being has 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? 2 in each pair. So 23 pairs, total of 46 chromosomes. In each pair, you get one from your mama and one from your daddy, or one from your biological mother, one from your father. They come together. So you get 23 chromosomes from your mom, 23 chromosomes from your dad. They pair up, and that basically makes you who you are in a lot of ways. Now, most traits, most things about you, most of your physical features are not determined by just one chromosome, but typically by multiple different chromosomes or different parts. Each chromosome has sections where they have genes, right? The genes are that's the building blocks or the blueprint of who you are. Your genetic code, the things that determine who you are these things called genes. The average human has between 20,000 and 25,000 different genes, all right? And they are spread out across the 46 chromosomes. Again, so half of your genes are going to be coming from your mom, half of them coming from your dad. So if you've got 25,000 genes spread out between 46 chromosomes, the genes are on different sections, right? So there's, hundreds, if not thousands, of genes on different chromosomes. So there are some traits that humans have that are determined just by one set of genes, right? So for example, here on chromosome pair 16, that's where, right? So if you look at your pairs of chromosomes right here, on chromosome 16, there's one simple section in that chromosome, on one of those chromosomes that determine if you have wet earwax or dry earwax. By the way, before I studied this, I didn't know this was a thing. I didn't know some people had wet or dry. I just thought everyone's earwax is the same. Au contraire, not everyone's earwax is exactly the same. So, right, this one little section of genes, right, on one section of one chromosome will determine what you have. So depending on what genes you have there will make the determination whether or not you have wet earwax or dry earwax, right? So there are some traits, these are called Mendelian traits, that are just singular in nature, meaning that the trait is specifically determined by just one specific section of one chromosome, right? One set of genes. But that is actually pretty rare in the human body. The vast majority of your traits are not governed by just one section of genes, but they're governed by different sets of genes, right? So you may have a few of the genes on chromosome 2, and a few genes on chromosome 13, and a few genes on chromosome 22. They function together in tandem to then determine what traits are you going to have. Your eye color, your hair color, what range of height you'll be, how tall you'll likely be. All the different traits about you, what genetic defects you might end up having, what diseases you might end up being susceptible to in the future. So all of the traits that you have, for the most part, are polygenic, meaning multiple different sets of the genetic code come together to determine that. Now, you also have a few types of traits that when these genes come together, or different parts of the chromosome come together, they begin to determine something about you physically, but they also then begin to govern other parts of the genetic code, right? So you may have, let's say, some genetic code in chromosome 7 that would determine that you would likely have a certain particular muscle mass. But based on a different chromosome, that chromosome can now begin to influence how that genetic code is manifested. The gene or the chromosome where this most comes into play is the gender, right? So everyone has 23 chromosomes. Men and women have 22 the same, right? Men and women, 22 of the 23 pairs of chromosomes are the same, all right? Obviously, the genetic code on those chromosomes are going to be different, right? If you have blue eyes, the genetic chromosome, the genetic code on your chromosomes is different than someone who has brown eyes, right? It's going to be different. But for men and women, biological men, biological women, the 23rd pair, okay, the chromosome number 45 and 46, the 23rd pair, are different in men and women. So many of you certainly are already familiar with this largely, right? So men have what's called an XY chromosome. Women have what we call an XX chromosome, okay? Everyone gets an X from your mother. So when your mother gives you this chromosome for pair number 23, it's always going to be an X chromosome, right? That's going to be the sexual chromosome in this pair that comes from your mother is always going to be X. Your dad, however, has about half and half, right? Different scientists put the numbers at different, some say it's like 51-49, but regardless, about half of all of your dad's chromosomes are Y chromosomes and about half are X chromosomes, right? So depending on which you get from your dad, right, it's about a 50-50 shot, or 51-49, some scientists say, of you getting, there's about a half of the chance you're going to get an X, half the chance you're going to get a Y. And if you get a Y, you're going to be XY in your 23 pair 23, and you will definitely be a biological male. If you get an X from your dad, then you're going to get X from your mom. You'll be XX, and then you will be a biological female. That's important, right? The chromosomes here, the X and the XY, are drastically different. The set of genes, right, the genetic code that's on an X chromosome versus a Y chromosome are drastically different in every way possible, right? Which is the reason why men and women are biologically so different. In addition to that, when the Y chromosome is present, it begins to interact with all the other chromosomes and begins to impact how some of the other genes are then manifested, right? The Y chromosome has the ability to kind of inform, govern, modify some of the other things going on. I'm making this super simple. Obviously, you could take a genetics class and learn a lot more details than this. I'm making it super simple for argument's sake here. It's important to note that when you look at a man's set of genes and a woman's set of genes, they are drastically different, okay? The X and the Y. But when you look at the differences within the genders, within the sexes, they're actually not that different. If you look at a black man and a white man, right, an African-American man and a Caucasian man, and you look at their genetic codes, the genetic codes they have between their 46 chromosomes are almost, there's very little difference between a black guy and a white guy. I mean, it's microscopic. There's just a few genes on a few chromosomes that determine what will make a black guy look like a black guy and what will make a white guy look like a white guy. The difference between a white man and a black man is extremely hard to see within the genetic code. They are virtually the same. It's remarkable. That is not the case for a man or woman, right? So a white man and a black man have way more in common, genetically speaking, than a white man and a white woman, right? Or a black man and a white man have way more genetically in common than a black man and a black woman. Like the differences between the sexes is drastically different. It's biological, right? So I think this is important because one of the issues that comes up in some of these conversations when it comes to contemporary issues and some of the debates and conversations around gender and sexuality in our contemporary culture, one of the major debates that comes up is the idea of transgender, or the idea of people can identify as whatever they want. But the science disagrees with that. And I think it's interesting that some people say, well, you can't choose what race you are. Like it's a pretty prominent thing. A couple of years ago, there was a woman who was born white and pretended to be black for many years. She actually being the president of one of the local chapters for the NAACP. I believe it was in Oregon, or maybe it was in the Seattle area. And the woman basically was outed later in life. She's actually not black. And there was this outrage. How dare this white woman pretend to be black? You can't choose your race. Well, if you can't choose your race, you definitely can't choose your sex. Like it's absurd. The chasm between white and black is minimal. It's almost nothing. It takes significant effort on the part of geneticists to be able to tell the difference between a white man and a black man. When you're looking at the DNA code, you're looking at 25,000 genes. 99.99% of them are exactly the same. But when you look at a man and a woman, the genes are drastically different, right? You have an entire chromosome that is drastically different. One pair of the 23, right, or 2 of the 20 of the 46 chromosomes is drastically different. In addition to that, the way the other ones are behaving is drastically different. So just the science is just not in favor of the argument that you choose your sex, the idea. Now, are there exceptions to this? There are some extreme exceptions. Occasionally you have people that are born with 3 X's, XXX. You have other genetic deformities that come out of genetic anomalies within within chromosome pair number 23. There are some things, but in pretty much all of those cases, you can look at the genetic code of the person, right? And this is relatively new technology now, right? Just in the last few decades, where we can look at the genetic code of a person and determine, genetically speaking, if they're male or female. There are people that are born with multiple parts, right? The people who are born with male genitalia and female genitalia, or some variation. That does happen. People who are born, what we would call in our culture asexual in some ways. Those deformities and anomalies do exist within humanity, certainly, but they're extremely rare. And in each of those cases, you can still look at the genetic code and determine, that this person is biological male and biological female, and that there's an issue that we can pinpoint. Right? The argument goes like this: well, since there's anomalies, you can't really go determine sex based on genetics. It just doesn't. And it's a ludicrous argument to say, wait a minute, because there's potential anomalies or potential mistakes in genetic code in a small fragment of people, that means we have to ignore the swath of scientific understanding we have for the rest of humanity. It's completely asinine, quite frankly. And so when we look at the genetic code, we can see there's a difference between men and women, and this changes much of how we function. Later in the course, later in this, for those of you who are my students, we will look at other ramifications of this, right? But there's so many things about men and women. We are drastically different in the way we view the world and the way we are developed, our muscle density and strength, the way our bodies are structured, the way our bodies develop, the way our brains develop, the way our brains understand risk assessments. I mean, there's all these things that pair, that 23rd pair chromosome, drastically changes how all the other ones function throughout human development, primarily in the womb and in early life, but really all throughout a person's life. There are elements of you that are developing well into your teenage years and your 20s, and that chromosome is impacting all of that in various ways, and we'll study that more in the future. But the science is overwhelmingly on the side that would say gender is binary. It's either XY or you're XX. Like there's no such thing as being XY but being female. There's no such thing as not having X or Y. Some people say, well, I don't have a gender. No, your gender is determined by your sex. Okay, like right there. It's in the science, right? The genetics, the genes don't lie. They're right there, right? DNA don't lie. So I think it's important to point that out as a part of this conversation. And again, the reason why racism is so absurd is because humanity is like black people and white people of the same gender, the same sex, are so close genetically that it's remarkable. The chasm is between the sexes, right? And you can't not have a gender. You're either XX or you're XY. You're male or you're female. It's binary. You're either this or you're this. And even if there's an anomaly or dysfunction or disformity in some way, you still have either X's or you have X's and Y's. Like you either have one or the other. The fact that there's potential anomalies don't make you not male or not female. For example, Turner syndrome. Turner syndrome is when a female is born with 3 X chromosomes instead of just 2. And the 3 of them come together to form chromosome number 23. Well, that extra X causes or wreaks havoc on that woman. Turner syndrome, if you Google it, a lot of women end up not being able to, they basically look like children, or they look like they haven't hit puberty for all their life. So a woman could be 25 years old and look like she's 10 years old. She looks like she's a late elementary school or early middle school age child for all her life. In most cases, women who have Turner syndrome, they're going to have various health issues. Several different parts of their body are going to be impacted by that. They are, in most cases, going to be infertile. They're not going to be able to have children or get pregnant ever. And in many cases, the ramifications of this means that they end up not living very long. Many of them have a very, very short life expectancy because of the related health implications from that. Now, there are some people out there that would argue that because Turner syndrome exists, see, gender is not binary, because you can't just say it's just X and XY, because look, you have XXX. Like, wait a minute. So you're telling me because that woman has an extra X chromosome that I'm not allowed to determine that anyone else in the world is a woman based on XX? Think about that for a second. She has 3 X's, not one, she's 3. She has an extra one and no Y. And because of that, I am now not allowed to look at an X next and say that's a woman. That's literally the narrative being promoted by some people in our society. And quite frankly, I just think I think it's absolutely absurd. So that's the genetics behind it. That's the DNA behind it. I think it's important to understand some of that. Feel free to Google that and do some research additionally if you would like. Down the road, I think it'll be valuable for Christians to have a good understanding of how DNA structures work, how gender and sex is determined at a molecular and biological level, so to speak, so that we can engage in some of the conversations, because the science is on our side. As evangelical Christians, when we take Genesis chapter 1 and we allow that to inform our understanding of gender and sexuality, the science corroborates what the Bible teaches us. And it's not against, it's not anti what the Bible teaches. So I'm going to end this video here, and then in the next video, I'll do a part 2 to this and talk about how we know God created people different from a biblical standpoint.